So we're going to start going over chapter 14 today, and please pay careful attention to what you need to do over the next few days to get you ready. You will have an exam right before Easter break. Just to go over things, again, I'm right next door, Mrs. Mancinelli. If you have any questions, feel free to come see me. But we're going to start off on chapter 14, and most people really like biology from this point on because a lot less molecular and a lot more I get to talk about animals and plants and things like that. So the first thing we're going to talk about to start off our evolution unit is really, what makes a species and how do species form? How do you get a new species? And that's what chapter 14 is all about. So I'm going to kind of walk you through this very, very briefly. If you look over here, it's only 11 slides because I want you to have some time to discuss some ideas in class. And again, this being a video, the URL, I'll post it on the e-board, my Honors Biology tab. On my e-board, Mrs. Mancinelli, there's an Honors Bio tab now. Your Monday weekly essays are up there already. And I keep this as brief as possible to give you some time to discuss it. Feel free to pause it. Let the substitute in the room know you need it paused if I tend to talk a little fast and you're trying to write things down. And at the end of this video, I'm going to spend a little bit of time with you on what you should be doing in this course from this point on. So I'm going to kind of walk you through chapter 14, just go over the key terms, key words, and then on the last slide I'm going to talk to you a few minutes about, well, what should you do now? Because obviously in a 15-minute lecture I'm not going to cover the entire chapter. It's just impossible, and it's really up to you to stay up to speed on this stuff. And I'll tell you how you can do that on slide 11. You won't see this slide again on the other lectures after this, so I would pay careful attention here. Alright, so here we go. Alright, so what is a species? And I put up the section number for you so you can refer back to your book. Biology, we've got to be able to define a species. And the whole idea of naming and classifying species and determining, yes, these two things are the same species, or no, these two things are not, is called taxonomy. Now, if you're a taxonomist and you're a biologist, specifically naming and classifying living things. Usually you specialize in a particular type of living thing, such as plants or fungus or mammals, whatever. Most of the time, biology defines a species as a group whose members have the potential to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So, in other words, again, if you have one member of the group that cannot breed and produce fertile offspring, you have one, like human, let's say, that can't have children, it does not mean they are not a part of the species. It means in the group, these creatures, organisms, can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Now, this becomes difficult with some living things, such as bacteria, because they don't necessarily interbreed. And it doesn't matter whether or not they're fertile, they pretty much grow to a certain size and then go through binary fission, split themselves in half. So this is called the biological species concept, and for most of the time when we're talking about a species, this is what a biologist is referring to. But there are some other species concepts out there, and you should be aware of them. You should know what they are and some examples of them. They are in your textbook. There's the morphological species concept, morphological, and then there's genealogical species concept and ecological species concept. So you should go over those. You should be able to read them, define them, make sure you understand basic examples of them. It'd be pretty important to know. But most of the time when I refer to a species, I'm using this definition, and most biologists are. Alright, so what keeps species separate? You have to have some barriers to reproduction in order to keep species separate. They're called reproductive barriers. And there are ones called prezygotic, which means before there is even a fertilized egg. A zygote's a fertilized egg. This happens before. There are some ways to keep species separate. One is called temporal, and that is basically when species breed, they have breeding seasons, and perhaps one species season does not overlap with another. So for instance, here's a bullfrog and here's a spring peeper. They both live in New Jersey. They both live in similar areas, lakes, ponds, things like that. This American bullfrog is really only looking for mates in mid to late summer, July, maybe parts of June, early August. Spring peeper starts early. That's why they're called spring peepers. These are the guys that sound like 1,000 crickets. If you're driving past a lake or something one day and you hear all this loud beep, 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 it's these guys. They're really tiny, and they start looking for mates early. Okay, like late March, early April. We'll be hearing these guys soon. You won't hear a bullfrog for a while, not until the summer when it gets a lot warmer. So they're temporal. They're not even looking at each other as mates, because when this guy's ready to mate, this guy has long since mated. He's kind of done for the year. And humans mate almost all year long and have the potential to have children all year long. But a lot of animals, like bullfrog and the spring peeper, are only really interested in mating at certain times. So habitat, of course, if animals don't live in the same place, they're not going to be looking at each other's mates. Behavioral, perhaps one type of bird has a certain dance and another type of bird has a different dance. So if you're not dancing the right way, you're not going to be recognized as a potential mate, or a call, or a song, or all different kinds of things. If you ever want to look at some interesting ways that animals have to find mates, really do some research on how birds find mates, because they have all different songs and behaviors. I mean, just look at the peacock. It gives you a good example of some of the things. Mechanical, basically, it just sounds just like what it is. Okay, you just can't have two animals that are not, similar in size be able to mate. Just won't work. And then gametic, sometimes certain things, like sometimes the sperm's lacking an enzyme, it can't penetrate the egg, it can't get through the I don't want to say wall, but it can't get through the outer portion of the egg so that the nucleus of the sperm can get in and fuse with the chromosomes of the egg. So those are ways, before there is even a zygote, that you can end up with keeping species separate, barriers. Postzygotic, you have hybrids that are produced when you have two different species, like a lion and a tiger. This over here is the liger. This is a hybrid. It is made from two separate species. And what you have is you have hybrid inviability. Sometimes the hybrid doesn't live to adulthood. Ligers do. Sometimes you have hybrid sterility. In this case, the liger actually is sterile. So if you want more ligers, you have to mate more lions with more tigers. And then hybrid breakdown. Sometimes the hybrid is weak, frail, infertile, things like that. So those are other ways. Even if you do get a zygote, you do end up with another animal. It simply cannot mate and produce. If you go back to this definition here, it cannot interbreed and produce fertile offspring on its own. So that takes that keeps the lion and the tiger separate species. Same thing with a horse and a donkey. They make a mule, and your book talks about that. So, in order to make separate species, sometimes you have to isolate two separate groups of the same species, and over time they can develop into different species. If you look up here, allopatric speciation is when there's a geographic barrier. So you end up with, and your book talks about, a group of squirrels end up here, then you have the Grand Canyon in the middle, and then you end up with a group of squirrels over here, and over time this group evolves to adapt to one area. The group over here evolves to adapt to the other area. Before you know it, the two groups are so different they can no longer mate, and that's allopatric speciation. And of course, adaptive radiation, your book talks in length about organisms that end up on islands and there's no predator and you have one ancestor species. And all of a sudden, from that one species, you get all these different species that radiate out from this one common ancestor. Darwin's finches are a good example of that, so I'll let you read that. Really, really good stuff. All right. Sympatric speciation, sometimes just a reproductive barrier forms. In Hawaii, there are fruit flies, and they recognize different food sources. It keeps them apart from each other. You get polyploidy in plants, and because of the polyploidy, which if you forget what that means, diploid is 2 sets of chromosomes, polyploid are more sets than 2. So you end up with one plant that's maybe triploid and another that's octoploid, which means it has 8 sets of chromosomes, and there is just no way that you are going to get any kind of reproduction going on between those things. This happens a lot in plants because plants can tolerate extra chromosomes really, really well. Strawberries are a good example. They have 8 sets of chromosomes. They do it really well. Mammals, that would never survive. It just simply doesn't happen. So it happens a lot in plants. All right, I'm going to skip this one. You can pause the video if you want here and just go over some little review questions. Not a bad idea. So we're about a little over halfway through. But I'm going to keep going. If you want to pause it, go ahead. All right. So how do reproductive barriers evolve? Basically, as populations change and adapt to different areas, they evolve to the point where reproductively they won't recognize each other, as I said before. So one of the examples your book talks about is the pupfish at Death Valley. You walk through Death Valley, one of the hottest places on Earth. You have all these little deep gorges, and there are areas with some water in them, caves and things like that. And in each cave there are these different pupfish, and actually almost every single area in Death Valley has a separate species of these guys. And they are so separated from dry area, one fish here and then a big dry area and then another type of pupfish over here. They don't recognize each other anymore. Even if you put them together, they won't do anything. So pretty interesting story. They're actually, a lot of them are endangered now, and scientists are racing to figure out why, what's changing in Death Valley. You know, what can they do? Should they do anything, or is it just nature's time for them to be on their way? Okay, so some reproductive barriers can evolve, especially once species are separated. Now, one of the things when we talk about becoming a species, speciation, is how fast does it happen? And a lot of people buy into the gradualist model, and this is from 14.8. And sometimes this is true. Slow, gradual, steady changes over long periods of time lead to new species. But there are times when it happens a little bit quicker. This is called punctuated equilibrium. Weird, but true. And all of a sudden you have one species and some disaster happens, and then boom, you get 2 or 3. And actually evolution usually occurs this way. And you can read about why we know about that. It has to do with the fossil record. Darwin first believed in gradualism, but most biologists today now buy the idea that punctuated equilibrium actually happens more often. All right, so what should you do now? All right, what you should do is read and read again, chapter. Create an outline from your lecture notes. I would add all keywords and definitions from the chapter into your notes. Not a bad idea. If you have the CD in the back of your book, you really should put it into a computer and give some activities and things a try. You should try review questions at the back of the chapter. Talk to each other. It's probably the most important thing. Ask each other questions. It's actually not a bad idea, little review hint. Write quiz questions to each other. Come in the next day with 5 or 6 of them. At the beginning of class, before you listen to your next lecture, see if you can do these. If you have notes on it, that's great. But if someone can ask you a question about it and you can answer it without looking at the notes, that's when you know you really got it. And again, this is not as difficult material as the genetics stuff. So hopefully, get to it. If you have any problems, let me know. Good luck.